In 2017, a team of scientists reported a strange discovery deep in the bamboo forests of Anji County in eastern China. Sections of a layer of mudstone 10 meters thick were spread across 10 kilometers of the forest. This had once been a deep water ecosystem some 445 million years ago, right at the end of the Ordovician period. And it's one of the few fossil sites that shows us the direct aftermath of the first and one of the worst mass extinctions that the planet has ever experienced. But to the surprise of the researchers, this site didn't paint a picture of an apocalyptic wasteland. Instead, it preserved the remains of a thriving and diverse community, thousands of big, complex animals that seem to have been living their best lives. And those animals were almost entirely sponges. Hidden in the forest, the researchers had discovered a piece of a weird but critical time in the deep past. A time when the first ever mass extinction may have turned planet Earth into sponge world. The end of the Ordovician period was a pretty terrible time to be alive. I don't know if you remember it, but when you get to be my age. Complex animal life in the oceans was still in its early days, having only really taken off in the Cambrian period right before the Ordovician. But just when the age of complex life had entered full swing, it was very nearly snuffed out entirely by the first of the Big Five mass extinctions. Now, we don't know exactly what caused the late Ordovician mass extinction, but we have a few hypotheses ranging from potentially reasonable to kind of out there. These include drastic shifts in climate and changes in ocean oxygen levels, volcanism, and even gamma ray bursts from deep space. Whatever the cause, though, the extinction event lasted around 2 to 5 million years and wiped out around 85% of marine species. This makes it one of the most severe mass extinctions in history, second only to the Great Dying at the end of the Permian, around 200 million years later. And the devastation hit all sorts of early animal groups pretty hard, including trilobites, brachiopods, corals, and bryozoans. And it was assumed that sponges had fared no better than anyone else. They're an ancient phylum of animals that live simple, quiet lives as filter feeders attached to surfaces underwater, unable to move much as adults. And until recently, basically no complete fossil sponges had been found in layers from the mass extinction or its direct aftermath. In 2015, though, researchers in China reported the first evidence that at least some sponge communities had made it through just fine. They found fossils of around 35 species of sponges from the Ordovician-Silurian boundary in Anhui province in South China, belonging to a bunch of different lineages. This was unexpected, and their explanation, which seemed reasonable at the time, was that this might have been a unique exception to the wider state of ecosystems during this period. These sponges must have represented an unusual group that had been forced into shallow waters due to a sudden lack of oxygen in the deeper oceans during the extinction event. They were essentially a band of initially lucky survivors that had been fossilized while trying to flee the environmental chaos, insofar as sponges can flee anything. But the discovery of the Anji biota in that bamboo forest 2 years later showed that this wasn't just a unique and isolated group of desperate spongy survivors. Because the Anji community, located around 100 kilometers away from Anhui, contained an even more diverse group of sponges with over twice as many species. And like the Anhui biota, those species belong to many different sponge lineages. This is important because it showed that they weren't the result of a sudden radiation of sponges from a few surviving lineages after the mass extinction. Instead, the diversity of these species suggested that, while whole other branches of the tree of life were withering away, the sponge branch seemed to have not even noticed that there was a mass extinction going on at all. In fact, the Anji sponges from immediately after the mass extinction were at least as diverse as modern sponges are today. Aside from the more than 2,000 individual sponges, though, the number and diversity of the other fossils in the Anji layers are more in line with what you'd expect immediately after a mass extinction. These included graptolites, 4 nautiloid shells, and a single sea scorpion. Not exactly a thriving ecosystem. And the next year, in 2018, researchers added even more sites to this rapidly growing pattern of sponge dominance in the aftermath of the extinction. They reported 7 new similar sites across 2,000 kilometers of what's now South China. It was a continuous and hyper-diverse mega community of sponges flourishing all over the place during a period of mass death for basically everything else. And the researchers argued that this was probably not just a regional sponge paradise. They proposed the same thing was probably happening in similar environments elsewhere, turning much of the planet into sponge world. It's just that not everywhere had the right geological conditions to preserve clear evidence of sponge world, and we hadn't specifically been searching for that evidence until just the last few years. So what was going on here? Why did sponges survive and flourish while almost everything else had either succumbed to the devastation or was barely hanging on? It just hardly seems fair. Like if you had told me that sharks or fungi or vultures or maggots love a good mass extinction and thrive on biological carnage, I'd be like, well, sure, that'd be good for them. But sponges? Those colorful, tubey things that just sit there looking pretty? They're the group that flourished during an ecological apocalypse? Well, it turns out the answer may be yes. Sponges soak up mass death like a, don't make me say it. See, sponges have a few things going for them that might have allowed them to thrive and dominate in the post-extinction world. For one, they're unusually good at tolerating changes in temperature and oxygen levels as animals go. And these two kinds of changes are often associated with mass extinctions, including, we think, the end Ordovician. Plus, they get their food by filtering organic particles from the water, which would have suddenly increased during the extinction as organisms died all around them. It's also thought that changes on land associated with the event, like the melting of glaciers and flooding of low-lying areas, would have led to a global influx of nutrients from sediment flowing into the oceans. And seeing as so many other complex food webs had collapsed, those nutrients the sponges would have usually had to compete with other species for were suddenly available in abundance, like iron, for example. Put all these factors together and boom, you've got yourself a sponge world. And it may not have been a single one-off event either. See, lots of sponge remains have been reported from other layers directly after later extinctions too, including the late Devonian crisis around 370 million years ago and the end Triassic extinction around 200 million years ago. While their level of preservation isn't as good as the end Ordovician sponges from China, they hint at a similar pattern of temporary sponge dominance following mass extinctions. And I should add, in all of these cases, the shape of the pants of these sponges remains unknown. Did any of you think I was going to get through this episode without making a SpongeBob joke? Anyone? We've even seen something like this in modern oceans following recent El Niño events that disrupt marine ecology. For a little while at least, sponges become unusually abundant. So sponges becoming ridiculously successful may in fact be a general symptom of ecological collapse, both in the deep past and today. And something we could even be setting ourselves up for in the future. But sponge world might be crucial for ecological recovery too. See, while it may seem like sponges have a pretty inactive life, they're actually ecosystem engineers. They help stabilize sediment on the seafloor and provide a structure for ecosystems to develop around them. Lots of other groups that were struggling to recover from major losses during the mass extinction would have found the abundance of sponges very useful to attach themselves to. Others would have found the stabilized sediment maintained by the sponges to be a safe and secure habitat to hide out in. And by forming mega communities, sponges would have concentrated organic matter into those areas, providing localized resources for food webs to reestablish themselves. And this may help explain why some other animal groups also recovered fairly quickly from the extinction event after being hit hard initially. They and we may owe the survival of our lineages through the end Ordovician to sponges, and the paradise they built out of the wreckage of the first ever mass extinction.
Eons is a production of Complexly, and if you like our channel, we have a lot more stuff to share with you. Over on Crash Course, we've recently launched a new Crash Course lecture on tuberculosis. In this long-form deep dive, host John Green will teach us about tuberculosis from a historical, cultural, and scientific perspective, covering the surprising history and current dilemma of TB. The story of tuberculosis spans far wider than most realize. The disease has left its mark throughout human history worldwide, and throughout global cultures with impacts in contemporary fashion, geography, and so much more. It's a fascinating watch. Check it out in the link in the description.
Who lives in a pineapple under the sea? This month's Eontologists. What did you think I was gonna say? Oh, I should have brought my pirate outfit for this.
Jake Hart, Raphael Hassa, Annie and Eric Higgins, John Davison Ing, Melanie Lamb Carnivale, Addie, Tony Dye, and Juan M.
Become an Eonite at patreon.com/eons and you can get fun perks like submitting a trivia question for me. Here's one from Seamus Yossarian. True or false, we are closer to the end of the Cretaceous period today than the start of the Jurassic period is to the start of the Cretaceous. Oh, this is basically math. This is not fair. Put your guesses in the comments and stick around after the blooper to get the answer. And always, thanks for joining me in the Adam Lowe studio. Sorry, I'm still thinking about the question. Subscribe at youtube.com/eons for more happenings in the Holocene. And until recently, basically no complete fossil sponges have been found in layers from the mass extinction or its direct aftermath. Or as the Brits say, aftermaths.
Aftermath, we would say.
Aftermaths. Ready for the answer to the trivia question? Because here it is. False. Huh. It's been 66 million years since the Cretaceous ended, yes, but the entire Jurassic period was only about 56 million years long. I think what it was daylight savings, and I didn't set my clock back, so that's why I got that wrong. Did you get it right? Because I didn't.